You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible Study for the 21st century. Hello friends, Jim Cantelon here. Always good to spend a little time with you, once a week at least, maybe every day on your computer, it's up to you. But we are in the process of reading very slowly through what's called the Passion of Jesus, the Passion of the Christ, the story of Jesus' arrest, his death by crucifixion, his resurrection. It is the powerful center of the gospel, not to be missed, and we'll get right back to it after this short break.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care. Care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partner champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and president Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So last time we were at the point in Matthew's account where Jesus and the disciples have left the upper room and they have walked down into the Kidron Valley and up a third of the way up the Mount of Olives to the beautiful Garden of Gethsemane. And there in the darkness, probably early morning, maybe 2, 3 in the morning, we don't know exactly, Jesus has time for prayer. He leaves 8 of his disciples at the entry to the garden. He takes I call them the Transfiguration 3, Peter, James, and John, into the inner part of the garden with him, leaves them, and then walks a little further on and falls either prostrate with his face to the ground or on his knees with his face on the ground, and he begins to pray. This story is so well known. The disciples fall asleep. Anyway, finally the time comes because Jesus, I'm sure, looked across the valley and he saw the lights and heard some of the commotion of the arresting party who were coming for him, and he knew this was happening. And he was sure the disciples he'd left at the entrance to the garden would see it as well. He wakes up the 3 and goes back to the entrance and waits for this arresting party to arrive. So let's pick it up there, verse 47 of chapter 26. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. You think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching. You didn't arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then, and I want to underline this because I find this so key. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled, with an emphasis on all. Yeah, Peter will deny him in an hour or so, but all the disciples have deserted him, have abandoned Jesus. It's over, at least for the short term. This large crowd of ruffians that arrived to arrest Jesus, and I do say crowd of ruffians because there were the temple guards who would be like modern-day policemen who would have a uniform and a certain air of authority, but then they were joined by this band of irregulars, just people who had nothing better to do than to go where the action was and get involved in the exciting arrest of this disturber. So they have swords, they have clubs, they have any other cudgel they can lay their hands on. A motley crew, for sure. And Judas may have already been harboring doubts. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, a number of things happen in succession. Judas approaches Jesus and kisses him, and thereby signals to the arresting officers whom it was that they were seeking. The unruly crowd is milling about and probably shouting bad words. And in the heat of the moment, one of the Galileans, and Matthew doesn't say who it was, a lot of us suspect it was Peter. Anyway, whoever it was should have known better, took a wild swing with his sword, trying to behead one of the high priest's slaves. Fortunately, he wasn't very accurate, just cut off the guy's ear. Jesus steps in, rebukes the would-be defender, reminds him that he had thousands of angels at his beck and call, and then submits himself meekly to the officials. He saw this sorry drama as a fulfillment of prophecy. And at this point, all the disciples, to a man, deserted him and fled. And so the messianic trajectory seemed doomed. Well, what happens next? Those who had arrested Jesus, verse 57, took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they didn't find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied, "but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He's worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face, struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Now, this is stuff worthy of a movie, isn't it? This kangaroo court met at the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. I've been there many times. It doesn't have the grandeur that it did in Caiaphas' time for sure, but the building essentially is still there, or something is built on the foundation of the original building. We're not too sure. But they would have had to go back into the Kidron Valley and then up the Mount of Zion and along the southern edge of the mount to a place very near the top of the mount where Caiaphas' palace was. It's an impressive structure, has a big courtyard around it, has a huge cistern in it where especially religious zealots used to be kept sometimes. It could very well be that some of the prophets of the Old Testament stayed there at one point. Nevertheless, the scribes and the Sanhedrin joined the Sadducees, the temple officials. They were called out of their beds, not without a few mutterings, you can be sure, in the early morning darkness of Passover. To meet at such a time was just unheard of, because the law, the oral law, prescribed this very thing. Some 200 years later, Judah the Prince, who was one of the classic writers of the law for the nation of Israel, he wrote this in the Mishnah. In capital cases, they hold the trial in the daytime, and the verdict must be reached in the daytime. An acquittal verdict may be reached on the same day, but a conviction verdict not until the following day. Therefore, trials may not be held on the eve of a Sabbath or the eve of a festival. They were going against the law here, but they didn't care. They were on a roll. They'd wanted to arrest Jesus for months, and finally they got him. In fact, it may not have happened except for the fact that one of his own followers, Judas, basically hastened the plan. He catalyzed this whole event by offering to betray Jesus when he did. But now that they had him, they weren't about to let him go. Bring on the false witnesses. Bring them on. We got to nail him now. The false witnesses, however, were weak. Caiaphas, frustrated by these ineffectual liars, finally shouted at the silent Jesus, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus' response evoked relief and outrage at the same time. Caiaphas tore his clothes, pronounced Jesus guilty of blasphemy, and in Jewish law, blasphemy was punished by stoning, but these officials didn't want to incite a riot because Jesus was the people's king. Besides, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees didn't want to have innocent blood on their hands if he was innocent. They knew he was innocent. They wanted the Romans to kill him as a pretender to the throne. "He deserves death," the leaders shouted, but under Roman law, their hands were tied. "So let's take him to Pilate. Maybe we can convince him that Jesus is a threat to the empire." What a story. At this point, Peter, who's in a courtyard, and he's not right there where Jesus is being tried, but all these people milling about, and there's a fire to keep people warm and so on. This is when he makes his famous denial 3 times, with a lot of colorful words thrown in. He proved to be a real coward at this point. But thank God, Peter became a giant. But he was at this point a giant, not only in the making, but a giant hardly in the making. He was embarrassed. He was ashamed. He wept bitterly when he finally realized it was he. Took a humble rooster to remind him. But nevertheless, as Jesus said, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And that's exactly what happened. Pathetic, human, but embarrassing. I'll be back.
Wow! Working for Orphans and Widows is a trusted Christian charity reaching out to the sick and the dying, the least of these in pandemic-stricken Africa and India. For over 22 years, Jim and Kathy Cantelon have engaged with community-based champions and church volunteers in the care for those whom Jim calls society's weakest link. Everything from home-based palliative care to the rescue and protection of young women and girls who are victims of abuse is done in the name of Jesus and is overseen by local partner champions and an army of church-based volunteers. WOW has a proven track record. Check it out on wowmission.com, or if you wish, you can call or write to us. Its sustainability is dependent on the support of faithful friends like you.
So, Peter has slunk away. I I don't know if there was much a variance between his emotions and Judas's emotions at that time. Judas was feeling guilty for what he'd done. It suddenly, I think, hit him full in the face that he's been a rotter. He's done something horribly evil, something he'll remember for time immemorial. And to the point where he throws the money, on the floor and says, I don't want it. Money that the priest had given him for his leading them to Jesus. And Peter for his horrible and shameful denial. They're both full of the agonies of guilt. Judas will commit suicide, Peter not, but you can be sure when the Bible says he wept bitterly, his tears were bitter indeed. Okay, so now they're taking him to Pilate, okay? Let's pick it up here. Where are we? Yeah. Early in the morning, this is Matthew 27, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us, they replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, it's against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That's why it's been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? You've said so, Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked him, which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message, don't have anything to do with that innocent man. I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What shall I do then with Jesus who's called the Messiah? They all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd. I'm innocent of this man's blood, he said. It's your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood is on us and our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Pilate was not a happy camper. Maybe at the best of times, he was not a happy guy, because being a procurator of Judea was a Roman punishment. They sent their minor officials off that little sandbox, over there. And, those people are always in turmoil. And let him deal with it. He did have a perk, however, and that was the procurator's house was in Caesarea. And Caesarea is a beautiful place. I love Caesarea. Used to take my family there to go swimming in the Mediterranean. It's gorgeous. He came to his headquarters at the Antonia Fortress occasionally in Jerusalem. His residence there was, kind of like an army barracks in a way, but it was situated in the northeast corner of the city. And he had a lot to learn, however, in the early days of his rule. Once he brought his troops into Jerusalem without removing Tiberius's picture from their insignia on their horses and their shields. And this was a cause of uproar for the very religious community. caused a minor scandal. And so he had to remove, this idol, from his insignias. On another occasion, he seized temple funds to build an aqueduct. Not smart. Beautiful aqueduct, by the way, all the way down to Bethlehem. Pilate needed cultural sensitivity training, is what he needed. But he was on guard with the religious officials all the time. And he certainly was on guard. He'd been roasted from his bed early morning. The light was just dawning. And, what's up? Here they go again. These people just never quit. What? Gee, I wish they'd go away, The tumult had been exacerbated by the sad story that had just occurred. The catalyst to the whole Jesus fiasco, that being Judas, had just created a scene by throwing his betrayal fee onto the temple floor, and then he'd gone out and hanged himself. And all this had happened before breakfast. And what Pilate wanted was for these raucous religious leaders to go away. Take your prisoner with you. Just let me have my coffee in peace. But no, he had a major squabble to adjudicate. So they thrust Jesus in front of him, and Pilate says, "So, are you who they say you are? They say you are? Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. In Pilate's mind, this whole uproar had nothing to do with his procuratorship. The one danger for him was that this king might lead an insurgency, which would not go over well in Rome. But this whole debacle for Pilate had a bad smell. What am I going to do here? Then he thought of an out. There was a true enemy of Rome in his custody. His name was Jesus Barabbas. Jesus is a very common name, by the way. Jesus Barabbas. And it was the custom to give amnesty to one prisoner a year at Passover. And maybe if he gave the people a choice, Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas, they might think twice and tell him to keep Barabbas in prison and release what his wife had just called an innocent man. She'd come from a very troubled sleep where she'd had an upsetting dream about Jesus. To Pilate's dismay, the religious leaders incited the mob to call for freedom for Barabbas and crucifixion for Jesus. In a scene really worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, he washed his hands in front of them, declaring his innocence of this man's blood. And then he acquiesced. Regardless of the hand washing, most of the guilt for Jesus' crucifixion still rested on him. But he, what am I going to do with this guy? He says. And little did he know that question would resonate throughout history. It's still a universal question. What do we do with this homeless Galilean? Now, that same question is our question. What are you going to do with Jesus? In history, there have been all kinds of religious leaders, some more prominent than others. And, it's quite common for people to say, well, take your pick, depending where you're born and your country and your country's national religion and so on. These will determine, whether or not you follow this outstanding leader or that outstanding leader. They're all the same. There's no real difference between them. So, yeah, you have Jesus. Somebody else has Muhammad. Somebody else has Baha'u'llah. Somebody else has whatever. What are you going to do with Jesus? You can go to the graves of other religious leaders. You go to Jesus' grave and it's empty. The critical factor here is resurrection. And I'll be getting to that in our teaching next time. But the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ be not risen, then our faith is in vain. We are of all men most miserable. We are liars. we are living a lie. We are teaching and preaching a lie. Regardless of how good Jesus was and how great, his moral, ethical teaching was, he's not who he said he was. If he has not risen from the dead. The resurrection was the clincher. It was the key historical moment. And because he rose from the dead, he proved once and for all that he was who he says he is. And so when the question is asked, what do we do with Jesus? We have two choices, believe or disbelieve. I happen to believe. I hope you do too. So friends, from time to time I show you this book. It's called Theology for Non-Theologians. I wrote it when I was pastoring in Jerusalem many years ago. It's been republished by 3 or 4 publishers now, and now it's come out again with a kind of a study guide as well. It is an introductory book, a good reader for those who've never studied theology, and it's written in very casual terms, kind of like this program. And it's getting good reviews, which I'm pleased about. It's there on the internet. You can just, Google Theology for Non-Theologians and find out how to get it. Publisher's established price. It's not cheap. I wish it was less than it is, but I put about a year and a half of my work into writing it, and I hope it will bear fruit in your life if you care to get it. Theology for Non-Theologians. Thank you for watching. See you again next time.